All right. All right. Hi, everyone.
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
How much do we have to participate to get the 100% in participation?
Well, really, it'll be as simple as just attendance.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but I do encourage you to try and jump in and if some kind of conversation or exchange develops, jump in and or if you have a question, anything like that. So the attendance is just meant to encourage the participation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, no problem. And let's see, we've got 19. Let's see. So what I'll probably do, what I'm thinking of doing, because I guess everybody's heard the news, barring any other craziness, pandemic related craziness, we'll be back to in-person stuff for this class on the week of February 7th. So that's going to be great. So everybody remember to review where the class is being held. I believe it's somewhere in the Tory building. Make sure you're familiar with all of your all of the health and safety protocols, of course, and all of that stuff that Carlton has been emailing us about all this time, right? And the reason I mention this is because I think what I will do is just begin taking attendance once we return to in-person classes. Now, for those of you who may not be able to make it in person, I know I've already spoken to a couple of you who may not be around on campus. And there will be options for you to join the live class, so you can still get the attendance marks. What I've done in the past is simply streamed my lecture over my Discord server. I may also simply continue doing Zoom calls, and you can join in that way. So there will be options for those of you who plan to stick around your domicile instead of coming to class. So no worries about any of that, in case any of you are thinking about that. But for my part, I'm happy to hear that we'll be going back to in-person stuff, and I hope that things can stay that way. Now, I don't know if they'll be recorded and posted. Possibly. If I'm doing it via Zoom, I suppose that is a possibility. So maybe it would be better to do it on Zoom. So yeah, I'll have to think about that, but I'll have an answer for you. I'll have an answer for you, say for our next class. I'll make a decision on what we'll be doing. And I also have one brief announcement other than all of this stuff. I'm seeking a volunteer note taker for this class, or rather note-taking services is seeking a volunteer note taker. So if anyone would like to share their notes, we have some students in the class that are registered with the PMC and require notes. So if anyone is taking notes and would like to share them with note-taking services, you can simply email note-taking services, let them know what class this is for. And because this is a volunteer position, this will actually go on your co-curricular record. It's like a transcript of volunteer activities that you do when you're at university. And this is actually pretty nifty because, as you may or may not know, oh, what was I going to say? It's gone now. Oh, yes. Volunteering can look really good when it comes to applying for scholarships and stuff like that. And scholarships are nice because, you know, it's money to help you with your tuition and your food and your expenses of life. So if anyone would like to volunteer, I think Katie says she can do it. So if that's something you'd like to do, Katie, that would be awesome. Yeah, it's quite simple. As far as I'm aware, you just have to contact note-taking services and they'll set you up. Elijah, yes, if you're writing them by hand, yes, you want to have reasonably legible handwriting. Some people may be typing though, which removes that issue. User-friendly notes. That's okay. Okay, so any questions about that? Any comments, any concerns about notes and note-taking beyond what we've said in the chat?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to say, like, I'm one of the people who were requesting it, and yeah, like, I would really appreciate it. It's not that difficult. You just like upload it every you know, like twice a week or whatever, and yeah, it just helps me out because I'm unable to like write very fast. So yeah, it would really help me out. So I definitely appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Yeah, if we well Katie, it looks like you're volunteering here, so thank you for doing that. It's going to help Ben and the other students who require this out a lot. What's the email? I believe it's just note-taking services at Carleton. I'm just going to look it up now. Let's see. Oh, I see. So there's here's a link that I'll share in the chat. And this link will take you to the landing page where you can sign up to be a volunteer note taker. And so you'll input your student email, what class you're in, all of that stuff. And then they'll get back in touch with you and set you up. All right. So now that the housekeeping stuff is out of the way, I'd like to pick up where we left off last time, which was, whoops, screen's a little busy here, which was around the point where we were discussing psychology. So let's see, while my computer's catching up with me here, just by way of recap, last time we introduced some of the problems with studying consciousness. This problem is really a problem of subjectivity. That's at least what Blackmore calls it, and we'll see as we make our way through the material today. You know, thinkers like Thomas Nagel, who famously asked what it's like to be a bat, say that what makes consciousness really intractable is the fact that it's subjective, and the tools that we have to study it are for studying things that are objective, right? And we talked a little bit about different metaphysical positions too, with respect to the mind and the body. Metaphysics, by the way, is that branch of philosophy that studies reality, right? It asks questions about what kinds of things exist. And of the things that exist, it asks questions about their nature. You know, what are they like, right? So we encountered a number of metaphysical positions. The big one, obviously, is dualism. The idea that there are two different substances, mental substances, or mental substance and physical substance. And this was most famously advocated for by René Descartes. René Descartes is a substance dualist. He believed in extended substance, which is matter, res extensa, stuff that takes up space, has mass, stuff like that. and Rescogatan's thinking substance, which he equated with the soul. Of course, there's other kinds of dualism too, right? There's not just substance dualism, there's property dualism. And we'll talk a little bit more about property dualism today. Property dualism says that rather than there existing two different substances, there's one kind of substance, this physical substance, but it has multiple properties. It has physical properties and mental properties. So somebody like David Chalmers is an interesting example of a modern day dualist, and he's a property dualist, or at least sympathetic to property dualism rather than substance dualism. Almost nobody in philosophy is a substance dualist nowadays. And of course, we also talked about monism, substance monism. Only one kind of stuff exists, right? And one kind of substance monism was idealism, like the idealism espoused by George Berkeley. Berkeley, of course, thought that the mental was the only substance that exists, or was the primary substance. And that's what idealism means. It means that ideas or mental representations are what are fundamental, what are actually real. And we can contrast this with physicalism. Physicalism is sometimes called materialism. I like physicalism better because physicalism includes, they're both the same thing, but materialism, I find, leads some students astray. They'll think of materials, solids and liquids and gases and stuff as physical. But you might be tempted to think that other things like energy, which, energy is not a material, is non-physical. And of course, energy is physical. So I like physicalism for that reason. And there are some other contenders as well. Epiphenomenalism, which we'll bump into again. Dual aspect theory, which is like property dualism. Neutral monism. Panpsychism. All of this stuff we're going to encounter again and again as the class goes on. But that's kind of where we got to. And then we started talking about psychology. And psychology has had a really interesting story. Philosophy has been around for thousands of years, and philosophy studied the mind. Philosophy studied everything in the natural world. But around the 18th century, psychology started to diverge from philosophy. And I think we left off around here. Here we're in the 19th century, where we have William James, who was both a philosopher and a psychologist. And in his book, The Principles of Psychology, he famously writes that psychology is the science of mental life, both of its phenomena and their conditions. So James is really cool, because he takes a very holistic approach to studying the mind. He wants to understand thoughts, emotions, sensations, beliefs and desires, everything in subjective consciousness. He even wants to understand, not just mundane kinds of beliefs, but even things like religious belief. James wants to understand the psychology of all of that. And it's really cool. And he's also famous for coining the term stream of consciousness. So you've probably heard that term before. I'm almost certain everyone has heard that term. And consciousness is placed at the heart of psychology by William James. Consciousness is at the center of it all because everything in our mental life is what's in that stream of consciousness, right? But he also didn't neglect the brain. He certainly wasn't a dualist. He thought that, yes, we need to study subjective consciousness, but we must also study the brain. And, we've come a long way since William James's day, where when, we knew that certain substances could affect one's consciousness by making changes in the brain, like alcohol or opium or hashish. But we were also dissecting brains, mapping the cytoarchitecture of brains in the 19th century. Corbinian Brodmann for example, was somebody who someone who was kind of a leader in this area. You've probably heard of when we talk about the brain, you've probably maybe heard of something called Brodmann's areas. You know, these are areas of the cortex that are differentiated by their cytoarchitecture, their cellular architecture, and by what they do, right? So that's just one example of ways we were studying the physical brain. James wanted to build on this stuff, and he also wanted to build on the studies and findings of psychophysics. And psychophysics is a really neat area as well. Come on now, my slides are jumping around all over the place here. Oh, we can't talk about Freud yet. We have to talk about psychophysics. There we go. Okay. Now, psychophysics is pretty cool. It's the study of the connection between physical stimuli and reportable sensations. So between objective outer events and subjective inner experiences. So that's pretty cool. You can see why James would have wanted to build on some of these findings. So in the mid-19th century, we had psychophysicists like Ernst Weber or Gustav Fechner, and they were studying relationships between, say, luminance and brightness. You know, how much power is going to the light bulb, and how bright do our subjects rate the light bulb, right? Or the relationship between weight and perceived heaviness, or sound pressure and loudness, right? Around the same time, we had other thinkers like von Helmholtz. He was doing things like measuring the speed of nerve signals through the nervous system. He was also studying visual illusions, and very famously proposed that our perceptions of the world are unconscious inferences, which is really cool, as I mentioned last time, because not only does it raise the possibility of you know, unconscious thinking, or unconscious cerebration, as William James called it, but also the notion that perceptions are a bit like hypotheses about the world. So when you see something, let me explain what that means. When you have a perception of something, you're not seeing the world as it is, as it really is. Indeed, does that even make sense? I don't think it does, but I don't think we can actually see the world the way it really is, if that means anything. But you know, what Gregory is saying is that the perceptions that our brain is generating are sort of, you know, constantly being generated, and also sort of being tested against what's going on out there in the world, actually, and being updated on the basis of how we move about and navigate the world. So it's almost like our brain is like a little scientist, you know, testing and poking about and investigating the world and continuously updating its model of the world based on the hypotheses that it generates. And of course, we test them with our actions. So very cool stuff. Okay, now I guess we can talk about Freud. Whoop. So the understanding of the unconscious that I was just talking about is what we might call the forerunner of the cognitive unconscious, which is nowadays how we talk about the unconscious as well. When we talk about the unconscious, we usually don't mean what Freud meant. Freud, interestingly, was a neurologist. So he was a physician. He was a type of physician, right? He was a neurologist. But he became puzzled when he would try to treat patients for, you know, various mental illnesses, and they didn't seem to have anything physically wrong with them. So he reasoned that the illness must be in the mind rather than the brain. And, you know, Freud's ideas are not very scientific. They're not testable, right? We can't really like derive theories and try to falsify them when we look at Freud. Nonetheless, some of his ideas have had quite a lasting impact, and that's interesting. I'd say nowadays Freud probably has a greater influence in the humanities than he does in psychology. And that's probably for the better. You know, if you want to analyze a character in a story, for example, Freud is great for that. If you want to talk about mythology, Freud is great for that. Freud is awesome when it comes to talking about culture, the human being, the human condition. But as a science of the mind, Freudian psychology is maybe not that scientific after all, but that's okay. So what was Freud's unconscious like? Tripartite division in the mind, like earlier thinkers, in fact. We have the id, which governed needs, drives, you know, the need to eat, to drink, sexual desire, stuff like that, the id. We have the ego, or the self, right? And we have the superego. The superego is what's responsible for repressing things that might be damaging to the ego. It represses them into the unconscious, but they can return from repression in the form of images in dreams or as neuroses. And this was the whole idea behind psychoanalysis, was to try to get into the unconscious mind in this sort of dialectical process by discussing one's dreams, one's states of mind, one's fears, was to try and get into the unconscious and sort of reintegrate those repressed elements into the psyche or into the mind, so that you had an integrated, healthy psyche. You know, on the face of it, it doesn't sound like that bad of an idea. And Freud's approach, his psychoanalytic approach, I suppose, has actually been quite influential in therapeutic circles as well. It's just that the theories that he comes up with to explain some of this stuff are really bizarre. You know, like the Oedipus complex, the Electra complex, penis envy, the castration anxiety, castration complex. That's where we start to get into a little bit of weirdness, right, with Freud, scientifically speaking. So that's why his idea of the unconscious has largely been replaced with this cognitive unconscious, which is a lot more similar to maybe what James would have been interested in, or what the psychophysicists would have been studying. All right, now let's move on. Whoops. Gosh, these slides are jumping all over the place today. Then we also have phenomenology. Phenomenology is very interesting. Phenomenology is a kind of like a radical sort of empiricism. And empiricism is, of course, the belief that the primary source of knowledge is sense data, or knowledge comes from the senses. Sense data is probably not a very good term to use. But it's based on subjective experience, and it's both a psychology and a philosophy. It was pioneered by Edmund Husserl, who famously said, this was kind of like the catchphrase of phenomenologists, to the things themselves. In other words, to conduct a systematic inquiry into phenomenological experience, or phenomenal consciousness, subjective consciousness. And I think it's weird. I mean, I was thinking about this recently and putting this course together. It's kind of weird how he says to the things themselves, because those are the noumena. That's not what he's studying. He's studying the phenomena. I don't know. I'm going to have to read further into this. It's been a while since I've done any phenomenology. But anyway, what you need to know is that phenomenology is this sort of introspective, empiricist kind of way of studying consciousness. What you do is try and bracket your scientific and logical inferences about the world and focus on your immediate conscious experience. This is called the phenomenological epoche, or suspension of judgment. Epoche is a Greek term. It means to suspend your judgment. The Stoics, for example, famously were all about suspending your judgment. So are the phenomenologists. Bracket your scientific and logical inferences about the world. Focus on your experiences. And this philosophy is kind of driven by this idea of intentionality. And this idea of intentionality comes from a thinker named Franz Brentano. Intentionality is this notion that mental states or conscious experiences are about things. They have content, right? Like if I'm looking at my mug of coffee here, and I have a visual perception of this mug of coffee. It has a letter J for Josh. It's full of coffee, delicious, delicious coffee. My experience is of the coffee cup, right? I'm looking at it. There's the coffee cup. I can have an experience of drinking the coffee. Wonderful coffee. So my experience is about the coffee cup or about the taste of coffee. So my conscious experience has intentionality. It has content, right? Physical objects aren't about anything, right? This is actually called this idea that intentionality is what makes something mental, is the mark of the mental, is called Brentano's thesis. How do you know something has a mind? Well, it can be in states that have content. Go ahead, Drew.
So what if you have a conscious experience involving a physical object? Would that give value to the physical object, or is it still just the fact that the conscious experience is a conscious experience with or without the object? Sorry, no, let me rephrase. If you have a conscious experience with a physical object, is it still intentional? Like, does it still have meaning?
Well, yeah, your conscious experience is about that object. So intentionality is something that mental states or conscious experiences can have, but not objects themselves. So,
okay,
because my cup of coffee can't think about anything. It can't perceive anything, but I can, because I have a mind. And that's why Brentano thinks that intentionality is the mark of the mental, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's what that means.
Okay.
All right, now let's on the next slide. So I guess phenomenology is a little bit related to introspectionism, which was developed by Wilhelm Wundt. And Wundt was actually the thinker who founded the first full-blown experimental psychology laboratory. Like, yes, psychophysics was going on prior to this, but psychophysics is not, strictly speaking, psychology. It's similar, but it's not psychology. So for this reason, Wundt is thought of as the father of experimental psychology. Now, he was a physiologist, but he wanted to develop psychology as a science, and he wanted to do that by studying things from the inside, thus introspectionism, right? And Wundt actually was a kind of dualist in his own right, not a substance dualist. But he does say that there are two kinds of psychical elements. Psychical here doesn't mean anything spooky or supernatural. It's just how thinkers in the 19th century referred to the mind, the psyche. So there are two kinds of psychical elements. There are objective ones, say tones, heat, light, sound pressure, and then there are the subjective elements. These are the feelings and sensations. So, for example, sound pressure is objective, but perceived volume or perceived loudness is subjective. And for Wundt, conscious experience really depends on how these two elements are put together in the mind, right? We have objective elements and subjective elements, and conscious experience depends on a union between these two elements. So the really cool thing about all these fields, psychoanalysis, phenomenology, and introspectionism, is they all focus very closely on inner experience. But this is where the problem of subjectivity really rears its head again, right? Because if you're, say, for example, that I claim to observe my private experience differently from how you might perceive your private experiences, well, which one's correct? How do we decide between them? How do we even study them, right? It's the problem of subjectivity again. So then in the 20th century, we get to a movement called behaviorism. Now, how does Blackmore describe behaviorism? Well, or rather Watson. Watson was one of the leading early behaviorists. He and B.F. Skinner, along with thinkers like Ivan Pavlov in the USSR, were probably you could call them the big three in behaviorism, right? So what does Watson say? He says, psychology, as the behaviorist views it, is purely objective, experimental branch of natural science, which needs introspection as little as do the sciences of chemistry and physics. Chemists and physicists don't do introspection when they're studying the world. Why should psychologists do it? Watson is saying. We shouldn't rely on introspection, right? Instead, we should rely on things we can observe. And what do we observe? Well, we can observe behavior. Yeah. Yeah. Well, the slides are already posted. They're on Brightspace. So yeah. So you should be able to find them there. Anyway, we should objectively observe behavior. That's what we can do. Yeah, no problem. That's what it's possible to do. So that's what we will do. Now, Watson developed this idea based on Ivan Pavlov's finding. Ivan Pavlov is famous for Pavlov's dogs. Is anybody familiar with Pavlov's dogs? I'll just kick this over to the class.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Ring the bell.
Right. Yeah, they ring a bell. The story of what was going on is that Pavlov has these dogs in his laboratory, and he's got to feed them every day. Obviously, you got to take care of your puppers. So there's a bell on the door to the lab where the dogs are kept, and Pavlov noticed that the dogs were associating their meal with the ringing of this bell, so they would salivate when they heard the bell. And this is known as classical conditioning. This is what Watson and Pavlov are kind of famously associated with, is this notion of classical conditioning. In classical conditioning, what you have is a stimulus, a neutral stimulus, that you want to pair with a certain kind of behavior, right? So for example, we've got a conditioned stimulus like food, and then a behavior associated with it like salivating. And what you want to do is associate the neutral stimulus, the bell, with the food. That's classical conditioning. And that's what Watson and Pavlov were famously known for. B.F. Skinner later came along and studied operant conditioning. This is where you condition an animal, usually a rat or a pigeon in these studies. You condition them through reinforcement to do some kind of behavior that's not natural. Like a dog salivating when there's food present is natural. It's, completely unconditioned behavior. In operant conditioning, we're doing things like, teaching animals to pull levers and push buttons, or to navigate mazes, right? So we're doing things that they wouldn't normally be doing. And Skinner very famously thought that human behavior was shaped by one's history of associations and reinforcement. All the behaviorists, Watson, Skinner, all of them, thought that all learning was the product of conditioning. All of it, even language learning, they thought was the product of conditioning. And sure, some learning is the product of conditioning. Okay, yeah. Obviously, if you're training a pet, you're using some combination of classical and operant conditioning, right? Like if you're teaching your dog a trick. Okay, that makes sense. Maybe some things we teach human children, we use conditioning for, right? Like if you finish your homework, you can play video games, right? So maybe we could teach a child discipline by giving it a reward, giving him or her a reward, for the desired behavior, right? But is all learning the product of conditioning? Really? No, probably not. But we'll get to that. Skinner was convinced that all learning was the product of conditioning, though, and he thought that with the right conditioning, we could create a human utopia. If only we conditioned all of our kids the right way, we'd have a perfect society, Skinner thought. Very crazy. In fact, if you want to see something kind of disturbing, oh, who's that calling me? I'm going to have to call them. If you want to see something disturbing, you can look up the experiments with little Albert. These are behaviorist experiments that were done with a human infant that was taught to be frightened of a very cute rabbit through conditioning. So that's a little disturbing. We'd never perform this experiment nowadays, but this is what the behaviorists thought all learning amounted to, right? So we got some question. Yeah, very ethical, right? Poor kid, I agree. Katie's raised her hand. Go ahead, Katie.
Didn't they just like, after like they conditioned Albert to be afraid or whatever, didn't they just like throw him out and be like, you're done or whatever?
Yeah.
We're not going to try to fix you.
I don't think they did try to fix him. I think,
Yeah, that's what I thought.
yeah, I think poor Albert probably would have had some stuff he needed to work out
Yep.
as a result of that experiment, you know. And that's you know, and that raises that raises an interesting point about the ethics of doing research with humans, right? Like it's crazy the number of psychological studies that have been performed that you would never get them through ethics now. You know, little Albert, the Stanford prison experiment, obviously Milgram's experiments, like you'd never ever get these through ethics now for good reason. So, you know, but so if you want to have some nightmare fuel, check out little Albert. But Skinner believed, as you may have guessed, that consciousness is an epiphenomenon. And it's not psychology's job to investigate it because it's subjective. We can't observe it. And it doesn't play a causal role in mental life anyway. That's what epiphenomenalism means, if you recall. You know, I mentioned Thomas Henry Huxley was a famous epiphenomenalist in our previous class. Huxley's actual analogy that he would use to explain this was a steam engine. You know, he would say that the mind is like the steam engine. And the steam is like consciousness. The steam is just a byproduct, an after effect, right? The steam coming out and making the whistle blow doesn't do anything, right? The steam drives the engine, yes, but the steam that blows the whistle doesn't do anything in the engine. It's just like a byproduct, right? Our consciousness is like that steam whistle. That's what Huxley believed. That's what Skinner believes. So it wasn't psychology's job to study consciousness, which is a real shame, because as a result of behaviorism, you know, it kind of abolished the study of psychology, or abolished the study of consciousness in psychology for years. Consciousness kind of became a dirty word. Now, behaviorism, as I mentioned a moment ago, did have some successes, right? It can explain some forms of learning, both human and animal. But it's a real shame that it abolished the study of consciousness. You know, not only did the behaviorists throw out, you know, things like introspectionism or phenomenology, it even threw out, you know, even-handed approaches like William James's approach. You know, psychology is supposed to be the science of mental life, and the behaviorists say, no, William James, psychology is the study of behavior, because behavior is the only thing that we can observe. We can't observe inner states. I mean, you can observe your own inner states, but that's just anecdote. And I can't observe your inner states. Your mind, your consciousness is a black box. It's a box that we can't see inside of to study. So, no, we're not going to study consciousness, said the behaviorists, and they held a lasting influence. There was a lasting influence on the part of the behaviorists in psychology up until the 50s and 60s. Now, this is a long and complicated story, But the demise of behaviorism really started from behaviorist scientists like Edward Tolman, for example. Also, thanks to Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky is one of the only leading figures in the cognitive revolution who is still alive. And he's probably the most influential living scholar on the planet right now. So Noam Chomsky wrote a very scathing review of Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior, where he famously introduces his idea of universal grammar. Remember, behaviorists thought that all learning is the product of conditioning. Chomsky says, like, you're crazy. Look at how quickly children learn language. There's no way they're learning all of this from scratch. Some of this must be innate in the mind. So he has universal grammar and all of those interesting ideas. And then other forms of psychology started to emerge as well, particularly cognitive psychology. That's what's relevant for our purposes here. It would eventually replace behaviorism. And the cool thing about cognitive psychology is that it emphasizes information processing, mental representations, even mental imagery was studied, right? So, and this is due to thinkers like George Miller and Donald Broadbent, Ulrich Neisser, he's the guy who coined the term, in fact. So cognitive psychology emerged in the 50s and 60s and started to replace behaviorism, which I think is a good thing. Do you think the emergence of oh, that's a really good question. Yeah, because around the 60s, this is a really good question. This is a fun bit of history because, yeah, now that I think about it, a lot of things were coming together at that time. In the 1950s.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to also mention how Aldous Huxley, who was very involved in psychedelic research in the 60s, was, I think, grandson or somehow related to Huxley before, who was studying, which was it, epiphenomenalism? I forget which, but
yeah,
it's a family trait as well.
Yeah, and Huxley was famous for his experiments with mescaline, which is the alkaloid in the peyote cactus, right? You can read his book, The Doors of Perception, where he talks about this. But yeah, there was a lot going on. A lot of things were coming together. Literary figures like Huxley were experimenting with peyote. As Elijah mentions here, the US government was studying psychedelics. The US government, which you've probably heard about MK Ultra. The United States government was studying LSD. The idea was to use it for interrogating people. But the people who were recruited for these studies, people like Allen Ginsberg, would go on to, kind of become hippies and start the whole hippie thing, right? In the 1950s, there was also an American banker who introduced psilocybin mushrooms to the United States. And shortly after that, in the 60s, you had people like Timothy Leary who were advocating for the use of psychedelics in therapeutic settings, which is only now just coming back into fashion. So I guess this is a really roundabout way of saying, actually, no, I don't think that this is why consciousness started to get talked about again, because yes, there were some thinkers interested in the use of psychedelics, but it primarily became a counterculture phenomenon, and it was shunned in academic circles after psilocybin and LSD were made illegal in the 70s. And that shut down research on this, which is a real shame. I think it's a crying shame, because I think that not only would research into psychedelics make for a very interesting area in consciousness studies. I mean, Blackmore just has a whole chapter on this in this book on altered states of consciousness. But it also looks like some of these substances may have very powerful therapeutic benefits for treatment-resistant depression, for example, or post-traumatic stress disorder. So, you know, they might have given things a little push, but I don't think they're directly responsible for the reintroduction of consciousness. I think it's more of you know, there were things that psychologists wanted to study, like mental imagery, that we couldn't really do without talking about conscious experience anyway. So, and as I say on the slides here, you know, consciousness still kind of remained a dirty word for some psychologists, right? Even George Miller himself writes, consciousness is a word worn smooth by a million tongues. Depending on upon the figure of speech chosen, it is a state of being, a substance, a process, a place, an epiphenomenon, an emergent aspect of nature, or the only true reality. Maybe we should ban the word for a decade or two until we can develop more precise terms for several uses, which consciousness now obscures. You know, but as I mentioned before, there was mental imagery research. There was a little bit of research on alter states. There was even some disputes over what was happening to people who were under hypnosis at the time. You know, the 70s and 80s were a weird time for sciences of the mind. People were doing some really interesting stuff. But the fun part is that now we can finally talk about consciousness again, which is great because consciousness is cool and we want to understand it. All right. Oh, now we get to the mysterious gap. Ooh. Oh. So the mysterious gap, what is this mysterious gap? Well, David Chalmers in 1994 at the first Tucson conference in Tucson, Arizona, there's an annual or biannual conference on consciousness. And at the first one, David Chalmers, who was a young philosopher in cognitive science, introduced these two terms, and these have absolutely dominated consciousness studies ever since. And Chalmers himself, if you know, there's an interview with Blackmore and Chalmers in her book, Conversations on Consciousness. And if you read the interview, you know, Chalmers is like, oh, I just wanted to clarify some terms and stuff before I got to the main points in my paper. I didn't think this would take off the way it did, but yeah, this absolutely dominates discussion to this day. He introduced these two terms, the easy problems and the hard problem of consciousness. So what are these problems? Let's have a look. Well, the easy problems, as the name suggests, are easy. Whoops. We can answer them by just simply studying the computational or neural mechanisms involved, right? We can do psychology, neuroscience, computational modeling, artificial intelligence, all the methods of all the cognitive sciences to tackle the easy problems. So easy problems include things like discrimination of you know, visual stimuli, right? Like find the red dot amongst all the green dots or something, I don't know. Or attention, reporting, self-reporting mental states, control of behavior, right? These are things that psychologists and neuroscientists can study with the tools of cognitive science that we have now, right? These are the easy problems. The hard problem, Chalmers says, is explaining subjective experience, right? The hard problems are, you know, these kinds of questions, answering these kinds of questions. What is it like to be an organism? What's it like to look at a sunset or hear the note middle C? Why are such things accompanied by experience anyway? Why is there consciousness at all? Why doesn't it occur without any kind of consciousness, like in a computer or a zombie, right? These are examples of the hard problem. These are variations of the hard problem. The hard problem, as Chalmers puts it, is the question of how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience. That's, you know, the mind bubble. You know, how do the mental and physical interact? And specifically, how does the physical give rise to the mental? That's the hard problem. And it's another version of the mind-body interaction problem. All right, so we've finished off these slides, but we still have some time left. So I want to start the second set of slides. Oh, excuse me. Oh my goodness.
What's you?
Thank you. Thank you. All right, where have my slides gone? I have to open the other slides. Let's close these ones. So that was it for chapter 1. Let's look at chapter 2. We're not going to get all the way through chapter 2, but we can get started. From beginning. Well, winter air makes me stuffy. Dry winter air in your apartment, you know, it's not fun. I can't wait until winter's over. Right. What is it like to be? Specifically, what's it like to be a bat? We'll talk about that in a moment. What's it like to be a bat? Could we even know? What a silly question, you might be thinking. It was posed in 1974 by Thomas Nagel. He's an American philosopher. And he's pointing out that the question, how can consciousness just be neurons firing, is a very different kind of question from how can water be H2O? Why is it a different kind of question? Well, because of subjectivity. And as I mentioned at the start of this lecture, it's subjectivity that's what makes the mind-body problem intractable. You know, and what is subjectivity anyway? Well, subjectivity here means that there is something that it's like to be conscious, to have experience. You know, there's something that it's like to have this subjective point of view. Maybe. I'll have to look into that, but I'll repost. I'll make sure I repost the proper slides in case I've messed that up. Yeah, I'll have to look. Anyway, I'll have to take care of that after class, but we can follow along here on my screen. So Nagel doesn't mean things like this. He's not asking like, why does my coffee taste like soap instead of coffee? You know, he's not asking something like why your professor talks like a robot rather than a human. You know, he's not discussing comparisons, analogies, similes, you know, metaphors. He's not doing that. What he's talking about is what experience is like for a being, right? So he's talking about what is it like to be like an astronaut or a frog or a bacterium or, of course, a bat. Try to imagine being a bat if you can. And we'll see why this is tricky. You know, it's hard to imagine being a bat for reasons that we'll get to in a moment. So, you know, there's that saying, blind as a bat, which is really a misnomer because bats actually have pretty good vision. But they supplement it without being Batman, exactly. But even Batman is merely is just a guy, right? But what is it like to be Batman? At least you can ask Batman, but you can't ask a bat. So bats actually see pretty well, but they supplement their vision with echolocation. You know, they use sonar basically. Some of their sounds are sonic and some are ultrasonic. So some are beyond the range of human hearing and some are not. And they make these clicks to find prey or navigate their environment. I visit with them often, actually. You know, in the summertime, I live right beside Cathcart Park. And the bats, there are bats that live in all the buildings around here. And at night in the summertime or at dusk, they come out and they all fly over to the park and you can see them flying around and you can hear some of them making their little squeaky clicks, trying to catch bugs. It's very cool to watch, very fascinating. So these, I don't know what kind of bats these are, just run-of-the-mill bats. But there are lots of different kinds of bats and they all emit different kinds of clicks, right? Some bats will make sort of like slow clicks to save energy, but their clicks will speed up as they get closer to their prey so that they can kind of home in on it. Bats also have really cool mechanisms in their ears that protect their hearing from their own clicks. So they can block out loud clicks when they're making them, but let the quieter echoes come back in. So that's very cool. And some bats can even use the Doppler shift to figure out their speed relative to the object they're tracking. So, you know, the Doppler shift. A great example is, you know, if you're standing still and there's a vehicle driving by you, maybe it blasts its horn at you. You'll hear the pitch drop when it passes you. And the reason why that happens is because when the car is moving towards you, the sound waves from the horn are smushed together. So the frequency is higher, so the pitch is higher. And, you know, when the car passes you, well, the car is traveling away from you. So now the sound waves are stretched out. So this pitch is lower. Bats use this Doppler effect to kind of figure out where their prey is and where they are relative to their prey. So their perceptual world is one of clicks and echoes and all this kind of stuff. And I'm not going to put this video on now, but if you want, you can upload, or you can look at this video here on YouTube, which is from a cool BBC documentary about bats. Oh, you know what I just realized? Just to answer your question, Jeremy, the second set of slides by mistake. What I've posted on Brightspace is there's only one set of slides for this, and I've done a PDF version and a PowerPoint version. The first set of slides are in the week 1 module. That's what I think that's what the confusion is about. So sorry about that. But yeah, slides we just finished are in the week 1 module. This set of slides is the only one for this week. So sorry for the confusion. All right, let's talk more about bats. So if you can, try to think about what that would really be like, right? Richard Dawkins, the ethologist from Oxford, thinks that bats might see in sound. You know, maybe they have a representation of the world built out of this sonar data that's kind of like our representation of the world, our visual representation of the world. Maybe they have you know, the bat equivalent of depth and color and stuff like that, like we have. You know, we think of color, you know, we have our experiences of color and they're related to the wavelengths of light, right? But maybe for a bat, maybe color is related to the wavelength of sound, you know, and so maybe they see the world in sound. Who knows? Some what's Blackmore say here? Some batty sonar version of color, right? Is this what it's like to be a bat? Well, I mean, maybe. Can we really know? Could we really know what it's like to be a bat, right? We can try and use our imaginations like we just did and just imagine some kind of batty sonar version of vision, right? But when we imagine that, we're using our own experience as a starting point, right? We're using our own human experience to try and imagine what it's like to be a bat. And we can't pretend to be a bat either, right? We can't, you know, as I just said, we can't really imagine ourselves out of our own experience and into the bats, because anything that we do imagine is inevitably going to be grounded in our own experience. And we can't transform into a bat. Like, imagine if you had some kind of transformation, body mind swapping sci-fi chamber, right? Maybe you grab some random bat and you put my mind in the bat and you put the bat's mind in my body, which would be weird. Could you imagine if you were human with a bat brain? That would be wacky. But if you were a bat with a human brain, well, you'd just be you in the bat's body, right? So you wouldn't really know what it's like to be a bat. You'd know what it's like to be a human in a bat's body, but not a bat, right? But what if you just were a bat? Maybe I can snap my fingers and turn myself into a bat. Well, if I were a real bat, I wouldn't be able to communicate to a human what it's like to be a bat. And this is kind of Nagel's point about the problem of subjectivity. We can never know what it's like to be a bat, even if there is something that it's like to be a bat. And this highlights the problem of subjectivity, and this kind of makes it clear why consciousness as subjective experience is so difficult to study. I can't know what it's like to be a bat, and I can't really know maybe what it's like to be you, but you have a conscious experience. So how the heck am I supposed to study that? Does everybody see the problem? Just let me know in the chat if you're not clear on what all of this is about. Yeah, it is kind of weird to think about, but it's fun to think about. I mean, and this is why in the beginning of the class and in the course outline, I really try to emphasize that, yeah, consciousness is really cool, because on the one hand, we're all familiar with it. We're all conscious. But on the other hand, when we try to start thinking about how to figure out how it works, we get perplexed. And this is why, Blackmore warns the reader, like, you need to welcome perplexity. There's going to be a lot of this in this class, though, but that's what makes it fun. So
I just have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, like, I was reading the reading. It was talking about how Daniel Dennett, he doesn't think that qualia exist, and I didn't really understand his reasoning for that, And I was wondering if you could like touch on why he doesn't think it exists.
Well, the sense that I get from Dennett's work is that qualia are kind of illusory. They're kind of like an illusion. It's not that there's nothing happening, right? It's not like Dennett is trying to deny that there is subjective consciousness. Dennett just thinks we make a lot of category mistakes when we're thinking about it. And one of those category mistakes is to think that qualia are a thing. Kind of like the Churchlands, like Paul and Patricia Churchland, kind of like how they say beliefs, like, let's get rid of beliefs. It'll go the way of elan vital or the luminiferous ether or phlogiston or caloric fluid, right? Like, we don't need it. We can reduce it all to the neuroscience, right? And Dennett, in his theory of consciousness, which is the multiple drafts theory, just kind of explains experience without appealing to qualia in the way that other thinkers appeal to it, or at least discuss it. So that said, Dennet's also really interesting because his writing style is very easy to understand, but the stuff he's talking about is very tricky. So Dennett can be a little hard to understand. You kind of have to practice reading it a bit. But again, he's interviewed in Conversations on Consciousness by Susan Blackmore. And I would say starting there, if you want to understand more about what Dennett means there, okay, that's in the chat. That's right. Kind of like when a magician performs magic tricks, right? Yeah.
But like that's what I find tough, because like, even if they aren't real, like, this is what I don't understand, because they're fully subjective experiences.
Yeah.
So how can you disprove that they exist? Like, is he just saying that like, oh, I don't think this is a good way to, like, I guess, like, think about the issue?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
A big part of Dennett's project is sort of dispelling bad ways of thinking about the mind that have been inherited from like Cartesian philosophy, really. I think that's how you could sum up Dennett's entire career, is trying to come up with a naturalistic explanation of consciousness, and perception and action. He's got a very interesting way of doing it, and his stuff is fun to read. But I do get what you mean, Ben. Like, there's like how consciousness will turn out to, shit, I can't remember exactly how Blackmore quotes him, but yeah, I do see what you mean. There's a way he talks about it that, you know, you always have to ask yourself, is he saying that it doesn't exist, or that it's not necessary for our explanatory purposes, or it does exist, but it's not what we think it is?
Yeah.
You always have to kind of ask yourself, is it one of these three things when you're reading Dennett? So
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So Nagel, just to get back to Thomas Nagel, we'll probably just finish off on this slide, I think, and then we'll finish the rest next time. So Nagel's work kind of helps us to clarify what we mean by consciousness. You know, we're talking about subjective experience. You know, what is it like to be, whether we're talking humans, bats, or Batmen, or whatever, right? So that's good. Ned Block, another philosopher, adds some further clarification to our little lexicon here. What Nagel's talking about, you know, what it's like to be, when he's talking about consciousness in that sense, subjective consciousness, that's what Ned Block will call phenomenal consciousness, or P consciousness, or sometimes phenomenality. He explains as follows: phenomenal consciousness is experience. What makes a state phenomenally conscious is that there is something it is like to be in that state. And phenomena, you know, these are related to the ancient Greek phenomena, which means appearance. You know, how do things appear to you? Phenomena. So that's what phenomenal consciousness is, subjective consciousness. If there's something that it's like to be in that state, that is phenomenal consciousness. And he contrasts this with access consciousness, or sometimes a consciousness. Access consciousness refers to what is available for use in reasoning and rationally guiding speech and action. So there's two different aspects of consciousness here. There's the what it's like, and then there's the awareness of things that figure into reasoning, thinking, planning, where there's maybe not necessarily a phenomenal component to it. Although I have to admit, I kind of don't completely buy this distinction from Block. I mean, it's intuitive at first, but when you start thinking about it, especially if you raise the possibility of cognitive phenomenology, you know, then I start to have questions for Block, right? But anyway, Block asks, does what it is like to have an experience include whatever cognitive processes underlie our ability to report the experience? You know, as I just asked, is there cognitive phenomenology? Is there something that it's like just to think? Is there something that it's like, you know, does our subjective experience include the processes that we're calling access consciousness, right? If it does, then it seems like these two types of consciousness kind of collapse into one type of consciousness, you know what I mean? So you know, that's a question we've also got to keep in mind when we're talking about these two aspects of consciousness. When we're studying the phenomenal side of things, we need to use, we're relying on reports that people make of their conscious experience. Like maybe I'm doing some psychophysics and I play a tone, and I ask you to rate how loud it is, and I turn up the volume and you say it gets louder, and I turn it down and you say it gets quieter, right? I'm relying on a report of your subjective experience. Now, you've got to be using access consciousness to do that as well, right? Because you have to reason about what's louder and what's quieter, right? So I don't know. I don't know if this distinction is as helpful as it's sometimes made out to be. But nonetheless, it is a distinction that we'll be talking about again and again through the course, I imagine. So let's see. Actually, we could probably get through a couple more slides. Oh, qualia. Now we're finally going to talk about qualia. What are qualia? Private, ineffable, what it's like qualities of our subjective experiences. These are qualia. Singular, quale. So when I smell my coffee, I can smell that coffee, and that is a quale, the smell of coffee. My subjective experience of the smell of coffee. That's a quale. Go outside like I have to after this and shovel more snow. So much snow. It'll be cold. And that subjective experience of the cold air blowing on my face, that's a quale. That feeling you get when you listen to your favorite song, you know, you pumping up the jams, that like, oh, I really like this song, you know, that's a quale. When you see the color red, or, you know, I don't have well, I guess I have a red pen. This redness of red that I'm experiencing, that's a quale. And so on and so on and so on. Drew, and then I'm on.
Could you essentially boil qualia down to like a quality of experience?
Yeah, like well, quale I think is Latin for a sort of like whatness. You know what I mean? So yeah, it's those aspects of our experience that have a subjective element to them, right? And I think part of the reason why people talk about qualia so much is that qualia seem to be helpful for sorting out our experiences, like the smell of coffee is different from the smell of a cup of Earl Grey tea, right? What's different? Well, they have different qualia. I don't know how much that actually explains, though, right? So
Right.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, hopefully that, I mean, maybe this will become a little clearer as we go. This is, I mean, it's a weird idea. Like the idea of qualia, when I was first learning about it, I thought, oh, that's interesting, but I'm not quite sure, because we have so many different ways of talking about this stuff. We talk about phenomenality and subjectivity and qualia, and I mean, really, they're all interrelated and kind of the same, but we can also use them in different senses. So, you know, that's where some of my confusion came from when I was first getting into this stuff. But yeah, anyway.
So quality doesn't differ from like your own perceived quality of something. Like they're synonymous. It's the same thing.
Well, yeah, like your subjective experience of particular things are the quale. Yeah.
So like a quality would be a shininess of something. Like talking about in science, how different things have different qualities.
Well,
like,
yeah.
Would that be like, would qualia just be how we perceive those qualities?
Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah. Like, for example, going back to the psychophysics stuff, right? The sound pressure is objective, but the perceived volume is a qualia. It's qualia. Okay. It's a qualia.
Yeah.
So
okay, that adds up. Yeah.
Yeah. And just real quick in the chat, if the smell of coffee brings us back to a certain, yes, yeah, I why not? Yeah, it's those aspects of your subjective experiences. Yeah. What the what it's likeness, right? Next question. Iman, you had your hand up there.
Yeah, I was just going to ask what isn't a qualia, but you guys seem to have answered, like, have gone through the notions of all that.
Yeah, like what isn't a qualia? Well, anything objective, right? Like the way most people think of qualia, they have to be elements of somebody's subjective experience, right? So like the blue of my guitar, or the brown of that guitar, or the weird pink of this one, those are all qualia. And but not the properties in the object themselves, like not this wavelength of light and that wavelength of light. Those are objective. But my experience of those wavelengths of light on these objects, that's the qualia, right?
Okay.
Yeah. So hopefully that clarifies. Qualia are the interpretations of objective experiences by our senses. No. They are what is, well, it depends what you mean, right? Because because we can also talk about the senses in an objective way, right? I can talk about my senses like, okay, I have a thing of a certain color with certain wavelengths of light that are hitting my retina, traveling down the optic nerves, and they're going to my visual cortex, and they're causing such and such a firing pattern of neurons, right? That's an interpretation of that's my brain interpreting information from the world. That's completely objective. It's the subjective part. So if I have a subjective experience that is a result of an interpretation by the sense of, then yeah, that's qualia. But it's just got to be subjective, right? That's the key. That's the key. Ben, you had your hand up briefly, I think, before I jumped into the chat. Did you have a question?
Oh no, it was sort of similar to Elijah's, so it's all good.
Oh, okay, okay. Does this tie into the divided line where forms are objective, but projections would be subjective? Geez, you know what? I have not read The Republic since undergrad. Drew, would you refresh my memory of the divided line?
Yeah, so essentially I only use those two because those are the only two that I can remember. I know that forms are above the middle line and projections would be below the middle line. So that's kind of like your clarity from objective to subjective, where you have, like, I guess, like the example would be putting a block under a light where the light is shining on the block. That is something that cannot be changed, that cannot be like perceived. The block itself is something that is there, but like can be perceived differently.
So it's like a phenomena noumena thing.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah, I would say, yeah. Well, because Plato famously said that the forms, you know, the singular form would be eidos or idea, which means what is seen. Mm-hmm. But like what is apprehended by the mind, like what is seen in the mind, not seen with the eyes. These are noumena. These are things in themselves, right? So the good, the true, the beautiful, triangles, the even, the odd, right? There's forms for everything, right? And these are the noumena, the things in themselves. And you know, the what we see are the phenomena, right? The shadows on the cave wall, the stuff below the projection. The projection below the divided line. That's phenomena. That's why we're calling this subjective stuff the phenomenal part of, you know, that's phenomenal consciousness, right?
Right.
That's where it gets the name from. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
Okay.
Yeah. Now it's about time to wrap up. So, well, we haven't got too far. We've just sort of introduced qualia, but we can get going now. Oh, good. A question. Go ahead.
Very fast. I just have a question about the reading response. So I've read the template, but is there an info sheet that will like tell us a bit more about how to do it, like which topics are available to choose and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think that next class, I'll probably spend the first 15 minutes or so kind of giving you a rundown on how I would tackle this. But all I'll say for now is that anything we've covered so far is fair game. So anything in the book, the slides, or my lectures that has come up is fair game to talk about. Or if you want, you can also talk about an idea from outside of class, as long as you can relate it to what we've talked about so far, right?
Okay.
Now, I recommend you kind of don't go too crazy. Don't get overly ambitious because it's the first response. And I like to give a lot of feedback on the first response to kind of let people know what they did well and what they might want to keep working on. But yeah, I guess I tend to be flexible with the kinds of things that you can talk about. So, you know, one of the things that we can do next time is just sort of maybe people can offer some examples, and I can just say, yeah, that sounds good, or maybe not. Maybe think about doing it this way or whatever, and I can give you some preliminary feedback before you get started.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. So if that's everything, then I suppose we better leave it there, and we'll pick it up again on Friday, where we will continue talking about subjectivity and qualia, and then we'll finish off these slides, hopefully. And of course, I'll tell you a little more about the upcoming reading responses. Right. So if that's all, then thanks, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I'll have this lecture uploaded shortly for those who want to review, or for those who are not here. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you all for tuning in. Stop sharing my screen. All right. Let's see. End transmission.